Welcome to my channel. Sit back, immerse yourself in the story, and drift off to sleep peace. First, subscribe to my channel and don't forget to leave a comment. Introduction. The shadow Sidib beneath the marble Rome gleamed. That is what history remembers, and it is not entirely wrong. The marble temples, the triumphal arches, aqueducts carrying fresh water from distant mountains, the vast civic buildings where law was administered and justice, in theory, dispensed. Rome was a city that declared its own greatness in stone at every turn. And for centuries the world believed it, because the world had no choice but to believe it. The legions enforced belief with a thoroughness that left little room for dissent. But beneath the marble, beneath the forums and the basilicas, and the carefully tended public gardens, there was another Rome entirely. A Rome of cramped, stinking apartment blocks and 7 stories high. So unstable that landlords reinforced them, boast them with timber props that themselves became fire hazards. A row of narrow alleys where the sun never reached the ground, where the contents of chamber pots were emptied from upper windows onto whoever happened to be passing below, where the noise at night was constant and the smell was always the same, and where a man walking home alone after dark was taking his life in his hands as surely as any legionary crossing the Rhine. This is the Rome that the marble preferred to forget. This the Rome of the furunculus, the petty thief who slipped his hand into your cloak at the games. The Rome of the latro, the highway robber who waited in the shadows of the Appian Way. For the unwary traveler, the Rome of the organized crime networks that ran protection rackets in the suburra, the nightmarish slum district northeast of the Forum, where respectable Romans did not walk after dusk if they could possibly help it. The Rome slave traders who kidnapped free people from the countryside, and the Rome of the effractor, a housebreaker who knew that the wealthy merchant's townhouse had a weak point in the rear wall and was patient enough to wait for the right night. For 400 years of republic and 4 centuries of empire, Roman law concerned itself obsessively with theft. The 12 tables, the foundational legal code inscribed on bronze and displayed in the Forum in the 5th century BC, devoted significant attention to thieves and what should be done with them. Roman legal scholars of the classical period wrote enormous volumes on the distinction between manifest and non-manifest theft, on the question of what constituted possession and what constituted ownership, on the rights of victims to exact private vengeance versus the role of the state in management. They wrote all of this because theft was constant, because epidemic, because it was as much a part of Roman daily life as the bread dole and the chariot races. This is their story. Not the story of Rome's greatness. That greatness is the backdrop against which they moved. This is the story of the people who lived in the cracks of that greatness, who found their survival, and sometimes their wealth, and sometimes a kind of grim freedom, in the spaces that law and order left imperfectly defended. They were not heroes. Roman society certainly did not think so, but they were real, and their lives illuminate the ancient city in ways that the official histories written by the educated and the comfortable, never quite managed to capture. Chapter on the society that invented theft. To understand why Roman thieves thrived, you must first understand what Rome was physically. At the height of the empire, in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the city held somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million people within its walls. The largest concentration of human beings anywhere in the Western world at that time. And a density of population that the city's physical infrastructure was perpetually to accommodate. People lived on top of each other. They lived in buildings that were simultaneously too tall, too crowded, too flammable, and too expensive for what they offered. The wealthy lived in private townhouses, the domus, with their pleasant internal courtyards and their solid walls, and their dormen ostieri, whose specifically to keep out the people who had no business being inside. Everyone else lived in the insulae, the apartment blocks, and everyone else was overwhelming majority. The insulae of Rome were a particular kind of urban nightmare. Piplamere. A typical block might house 100 or more people in rooms, rented by the cubicle, some no larger than a modern bathroom. The ground floor was generally the most desirable and most expensive, occupied by small shops, the tabernae, that opened directly onto the street, their proprietors sleeping in or behind their businesses. Above the ground floor, the rent dropped as the floors ascended, partly because there were no elevators and the climb was exhausting, and partly because the higher you were, the more dangerous your situation when the building, as it inevitably would, caught fire. The Roman satirist Juvenal, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd century AD, described the misery of life in these upper floors with bitter precision. Woken before dawn by the baker below, by the schoolmaster whose students began their recitations at first light, by the banging of metal workers, by the shouting of creditors, by the constant cacophony of a city that never fully slept and had no consideration for those who tried. In this environment, the geography of theft was written into the urban fabric itself. The crowds that gathered at the forums, the bathhouses, the theaters, and the circus were exactly den that a skilled pickpocket required. The narrow alleys that connected one street to another offered escape routes that stun who had studied them carefully could navigate with confidence, while a victim stumbled behind the shops that opened their goods to public view from morning to evening were, by their very nature, presenting opportunities to the observant thief who noticed where the owner's attention wandered. The warehouses along the Tiber's banks, filled with grain, wine, oil, and the luxury goods that flowed into Rome from every corner of the known world, were targets of a different scale, organized, professional, and in some cases connected to the very officials who were supposed to be guarding them. Roman streets at night were a different world from Roman streets by day. There were public street lamps in the modern sense. A man who wished to walk safely after dark hired a slave to carry a torch ahead of him, and even then he was not safe, because the light announced his presence to anyone who might be watching. The aediles, the magistrates responsible for maintaining public order did not operate a police force in any way that a modern city dweller would recognize. There were vigiles, the night watchmen, established by Augustus in 6 AD, divided into 7 cohorts of roughly 1,000 men each, responsible for fire prevention and maintaining basic order at night. But 7,000 men patrol a city of 1 million was a ratio even optimistic administrators recognized as inadequate. And the vigiles were not professional investigators. Their job was to respond to obvious disorder, not to prevent the skilled, quiet crime that left no immediately visible trace. Wealth was distributed with the extraordinary inequality that characterized ancient urban economies everywhere. And in Rome, this inequality was both extreme and visually obvious. The senator's litter, carried by matched slaves, moving through streets where free men begged for the grain dole, was a daily demonstration of the distance between those who had and those who had nothing. Roman thieves did not emerge from a vacuum. They emerged from a society that had created the conditions for their existence with remarkable thoroughness, and then condemned them for taking advantage of those conditions. Chapter 2:0. The law and the thief. Roman law thought about theft with an intensity and a sophistication that is, even now, striking. The legal category of furtum, theft, was one of the oldest and most elaborately developed areas of Roman private law. And the sheer volume of juristic writing devoted to its precise boundaries tells you something important about how central the crime was to Roman experience. The great jurist Gaius, writing in the 2nd century AD, defined furtum as the fraudulent handling of a thing for the purpose of making a gain, whether of the thing itself, or of its use, or of its possession. This definition was careful and precise and deliberately broad, because Roman lawyers had learned from centuries of practice that thieves were creative, and that a law narrowly written was a law easily circumvented. The 12 tables distinguished sharply between 2 categories of thief that shaped Roman law on the subject for centuries afterward. The fur manifestus was the thief caught in the act, literally taken with the stolen goods still in hand, or discovered before escaping from the scene of the crime. The furneck manifestus was the thief whose guilt was established after the fact, by evidence, by witness, by the formal legal process. The distinction mattered enormously, because the penalties were wildly different. In the early Republic, the manifest thief, the one caught in the act, could legally be killed on the spot if he had used a weapon, or could be flogged and surrendered to the victim as a slave if he was a free man, or simply killed if he was already a slave. The non-manifest thief, convicted through legal process, paid double the value of what was stolen. These rules softened somewhat as Roman law became more sophisticated and more concerned with procedural regularity, but they never lost their essential character. The distinction between the thief you caught immediately and the one you had to pursue through the courts was always significant, and the law never entirely abandoned the principle that a victim had special rights against someone caught red-handed. By the classical period, the height of Roman jurisprudence in the late 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. The manifest thief paid fourfold damages, while the non-manifest thief paid double. But the underlying logic persisted. The moment of capture defined the subsequent legal reality. There was also the actio furti, the private law action for theft, which coexisted in interesting tension with the public criminal law. Roman law was not a unified system in the modern sense, and for much of Roman history, the prosecution of ordinary thieves was primarily a private matter. The victim brought the lawsuit, gathered the evidence, presented the case, and if successful, collected the penalty, which went not to the state, but to the victim. This was simultaneously practical, given the limited resources of Roman public administration, and profoundly unequal, given a wealthy victim with connections and a good lawyer was infinitely better positioned to pursue justice through these channels than a poor one. For the poor victim of theft, the choices, thus, were frequently limited to vengeance, if you could take it, acceptance, if you could not, or the kind of informal dispute resolution that operated in the neighborhoods and streets of the city outside the official legal system entirely. The criminal law, the leges publicae, came to play a larger role over time, particularly for organized theft and for theft accompanied by violence. By the imperial period, the praetor's edict provided criminal remedies for various forms of theft, and the extraordinary jurisdiction of the emperor's courts extended to cases of robbery that the regular system could not easily handle. The penalty for convicted highway robbers under the empire was typically death, and the crosses along the Appian Way bearing the bodies of executed latrons were as much a statement of imperial authority as they were a practical turn. How effective they were as a deterrent is another question. The evidence suggests not very. Chapter 3. Typepiece of the vice. Taxonomy of Roman crime. Roman writers were attentive observers of the criminal world. They lived alongside, and their writings preserve a remarkably detailed picture of the different kinds of theft that characterized Roman life. They were not systematic criminologists in any modern sense, but their observations, combined with the legal texts and the archaeological evidence, allow us to reconstruct something like a taxonomy of Roman theft that runs from the most casual opportunist to the most organized professional. At the bottom of this hierarchy, in terms of planning, if not necessarily of individual skill, was the pickpocket, the furunculus or sphenarius, the belt cutter. The crowds that gathered for public entertainments were the natural habitat of the pickpocket. And Roman sources describe the problem with a weary familiarity that suggests it was accepted as simply a feature of public life. The Circus Maximus, capable of holding 250,000 spectators on its most crowded days, pickpockets' paradise, the baths where people disrobed and left their clothing, and the valuables carried in their clothing, were sites of constant petty theft, despite the presence of supervisors called capsari, whose specific job was to watch the clothes left by bathers The satires of Martial and Juvenal and Evernel are scattered with references to items stolen in the baths: cloaks, rings, money, purses, sandals. Sandals. The Romans complained about this with the resigned humor of people who had stopped expecting the problem to be solved. The sector sonarius, the zone cutter or belt cutter. A picket, who specialized in cutting the belt or the leather strap from which a person's money purse was suspended. Roman clothing generally lacked pockets in the modern sense, and valuables were typically be carried either in a small bag hung the crumena, or in a purse suspended around the neck. The latter was safer and more visible. The former was more convenient and more vulnerable. A skilled belt cutter with a sharp blade could remove a purse from a belt in a crowd without the victim feeling anything at all. And the technique was refined enough that Roman jurists thought it of specific discussion in their treatment of the law of theft above the pickpocket. In terms of planning and organization was the housebreaker, the effractor, literally the breaker in. Roman houses and apartment buildings were not particularly secure by any standards, and the wealthy townhouse with its valuable contents a perpetual temptation to anyone who had the nerve and the basic technical skills to penetrate it. The typical Roman lock was a simple wooden mechanism by an iron key of distinctive shape, and Roman locksmiths were apparently as capable of bypassing these locks as of making them. The housebreaker who worked alone at night, when the household was asleep and the streets were emptier of witnesses, was a figure so common in Roman life that the legal texts devote substantial attention to the question of when a homeowner was legally justified in killing him. The answer, generally, was that killing a nocturnal burglar was legally acceptable, while killing a daytime burglar who had not hurt violence was not. A distinction that again reveals how seriously Roman law took the special danger of the night. At the organized end of the criminal spectrum were the latrones, a word that, in modern usage, has become simply latro bonnet, but which in Roman sources covered a range of organized criminal activity, from highway robbery to something approaching what we might call organized crime. The latro operated outside the city or in the spaces between cities, along the roads and through the countryside, and the Roman road system, for all its engineering genius, created exactly the kind of landscape that organized robbery required. Long stretches of road between towns, inns that might or might not be reliable, travelers carrying everything they needed for a journey including money, merchandise, and some cases the proceeds of business conducted in another city. All of this was a standing invitation to organized groups who were willing to use violence and had planned their operations carefully enough to escape the limited pursuit that Roman authorities could bring to bear. There were also thieves who operated within specific professions and environments, exploiting the access that their position gave them, slaves who worked as stewards or household managers. The dispensators and the actors were in a position to embezzle from their masters on a scale that no outside thief could match, and Roman sources indicate that this was a constant problem in wealthy households. The slave who managed a business on behalf of an absent master had opportunities for systematic pilferage that the law addressed in great detail, and that bad practice apparently never eliminated. Freedmen who acted as agents for wealthy patrons had similar opportunities. The legionary quartermaster who skimmed from the supply contracts, the city official who accepted bribes and looked away while goods were diverted from the public warehouses. These were thieves too, operating with the additional protection that their position afforded, and the Roman legal system recognized them as such even when it could not always touch them. Chapter 4. The Subura. Crime's heartland. If Rome had a heart of darkness, it was the Subura, located in the valley between the Esquiline, Viminal, and Quirinal hills, northeast of the Forum. The Subura was Rome's most notorious slum district. Dense, loud, violent of the fishmongers and the butchers, and the human effluvia of too many people living too close together without adequate sanitation. It was the kind of neighborhood that Roman writers described with a shudder that was partly genuine and partly theatrical, but that even the theatrical descriptions confirm was genuinely dangerous. Julius Caesar was born there. Seems to have worn with a certain defiant pride. The suburbs' streets were too narrow for wheeled traffic, and too crowded for comfort at any hour. At night, the district became something else entirely. A world of torchlight and shadow, where the vigils moved carefully, and where the establishments preferred to conduct their business in darkness, came fully alive. There were thermopolia, the Roman equivalent of fast food counters, that served wine through the night to the populations of night workers, insomniacs, and those who had reasons to prefer darkness. There were brothels, some of them operating from the ground floors of insulae. No particular attempt at concealment. There were the establishments of the kind that careful writers referred to obliquely, places where stolen goods changed hands, where the question of provenance was not asked, where a man who had recently come into possession of something valuable could convert it into cash without paperwork or witnesses. The receivers of stolen goods. The receptators were as essential to the Roman theft economy as the thieves themselves, and Roman law recognized this with its own category of liability for those who knowingly received stolen property. The receiver was the infrastructure of property crime. Without someone to buy the stolen goods, to conceal them, to move them through networks that put distance between the original theft and the eventual sale, most theft would have been less rewarding and more risky. The Subura, with its density and its anonymity and its tradition of minding its own business, was the natural home of the receiver, and Roman writers occasionally give us glimpses of these networks. Men who ran legitimate businesses on the surface, while operating as clearing houses for stolen merchandise below. The lupanar, the brattle, deserves a particular mention in any account of theft because the intersection of the sex trade and private property was a feature of Roman life that the satirists described with relish, and the legal texts addressed with characteristic precision. The practice of inviting a man to a brothel and then relieving him of his money and valuables while he was distracted or incapacitated was old enough in the Roman period to have generated specific legal discussion. The women involved might be free workers, slaves acting under their owner's direction, or slaves using the opportunity for their own benefit. The legal liability of the brothel owner for the acts of those under their control. And the question of what recourse a man had when he had been robbed in a brothel he should not have visited generated the kind of intricate juristic speculation Roman lawyers found irresistible. Violence in the Suburra was endemic rather than occasional, not the organized, spectacular violence of the arena with the arena, which was entertainment, or the military violence of the legions, which was policy, but the grinding Quotidian violence of a poor urban environment. Fights over money, over verdicts, over insults, over the 1,000 small competitions that arise when too many people in too little space, with too few resources. The knife was the weapon of the Suburra, as the sword was the weapon of the legionary. Smaller, more personal, suited to tight spaces and sudden decisions, the rich Romans who wrote about the district recorded their horror at its violence. But the residents of the Suburra lived with it as background noise, navigating its dangers with the combination of local knowledge, established relationships, and carefully calibrated displays of toughness that urban survival always required. Chapter 5 The Roads of Empire. Hegway robbery. The Roman road system was one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world, and it was built for military and commercial purposes. To move legions quickly from one part the empire to another, and to facilitate the trade that was the economic lifeblood of the Mediterranean world. By the height of the empire, the road network extended for roughly 50,000 miles, connecting every major city and provincial capital, reaching from the deserts of Syria to the forests of Scotland, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the shores of the Black Sea. It was, in every sense of the word, the physical infrastructure of Roman civilization. It was also the infrastructure of Roman highway robbery. The roads moved people and goods. People and goods moving through sparsely populated areas far from urban centers of authority were exactly the target. Organized bandits required. The term latronas originally carried a sense of mercenaries or armed men for hire, people who sold their violence to whoever could pay for it. And over time it broadened to encompass any organized armed criminal operating outside the city. By the imperial period, latrocinium, banditry, was one of the major security problems of the Roman state, serious enough to generate repeated imperial edicts, military responses, and the development of administrative machinery specifically designed to address it. The typical highway robber operated in teams, and the organization of these teams more sophisticated than the literary image of desperate outcasts might suggest. They needed safe houses. And in a world where the inn network along Roman roads was both essential to travel and entirely unregulated in terms of who came and went, the taberna or the mansio could be either a refuge or a base of operations for groups who had the right connections. The innkeeper, they needed information about what was worth robbing. And in a society where merchants traveled predictable routes on predictable schedules, and the goods being carried were often discussed openly in the markets before departure, good intelligence was not difficult to gather. They needed ways to move stolen goods into legitimate commerce. And the same market networks that carried legitimate trade could, with the right intermediaries, absorb stolen merchandise as well. The Emperor Augustus, whose reign represents the first serious systematic attempt to address the problem of public order throughout the empire, established the vigils in the city and attempted to extend some version of policing into the provinces through the use of military units assigned to road security. His successors continued this effort with varying degrees of commit and success. Inscriptions from across the Roman world record the activities of beneficiarii, soldiers detached from regular military service for police and customs duties at junctions and mountain passes. These men checked travelers, examined documents, collected tolls, and in theory suppressed banditry along their assigned routes. In practice, the stretches of road between their posts were often long and lonely, and a band of drones who knew the terrain could simply avoid the checkpoints. There are accounts in Roman sources of bandit leaders who became famous enough to enter the historical record as something approaching folk heroes, at least in the regions they operated in. Bulla Felix, who led a band of several hundred men in Italy during the reign of the Emperor Septimius Severus in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries AE, was described by the historian Cassius Dio in terms that mix official condemnation with something that reads very much like admiration. Bulla Felix was said to have operated in Italy for 2 years, despite the emperor's best efforts to catch him, to have released captive craftsmen and artisans, they're taking their goods, but always leaving them money to continue their journey, and to have mocked the praetorian tribune sent to hunt him down with a wit that Cassius Dio evidently found entertaining. He was eventually captured by a stratagem involving the wife he was having an affair with, a detail that carries the satisfying narrative logic of folklore. And thrown to the beasts in the arena, his story, brief and violent as it was, suggests something important. That the boundary between criminal and social bandit was porous, and that in a world of extreme inequality, the man who robbed the rich and occasionally helped the poor could acquire a reputation that made him genuinely difficult to suppress when the empire tried. Chapter 6. Slaves, Theft, and the Peculium. The peculium, any imp of theft, in ancient Rome that ignores slavery, is missing the most structurally significant feature of the Roman economy. Slavery was the foundation of Roman wealth. The labor system upon which the great estates were worked, the mines were excavated, the ships were crewed, the households were maintained, and the goods of empire were produced. At the height of the Roman slave economy in the late public and early empire, scholars estimate between 20 and 30% of the Italian population consisted of enslaved people, with even higher concentrations in the areas of most intensive agricultural production. This was not a marginal institution. It was the engine of Roman prosperity. Within this system, the relationship between slavery and theft was complex and multidirectional in ways that Roman law struggled to contain. Slaves could be victims of theft. Specifically, the theft of slaves themselves was one of the most serious property crimes in Roman law, given the enormous monetary value that skilled or specialized slaves could represent. A trained accountant, a Greek-educated tutor, a skilled craftsman, a physician, these were worth sums that would have purchased a modest farm, and the theft of such a person from their owner was a crime with significant economic consequences. Slave theft, the kidnapping of free people and their illegal enslavement, or the theft of existing slaves, was a constant enough problem to generate specific legal remedies and regular complaints in the sources. Slaves also committed theft against their owners, against their owners' households, against third parties they had access to through their work. Roman law devoted enormous energy to the question how to deal with slaves who stole. Given the complication that a slave had no legal personality of their own, and thus could not be sued directly, while an owner was not automatically liable. Everything a slave did, the noxal action, the legal mechanism by which an owner could either pay compensation for a slave's wrongful act or surrender the slave to the victim, was one of the characteristic institutions of Roman private law, and it arose precisely from this problem of the slave who stole or committed violence. The peculium, the fund of money or property that a slave was allowed to manage as if it were their own, while remaining legally the property of the master, created a peculiar space in the Roman economy where, though the line between legal accumulation and theft was genuinely blurry, a slave with a peculium could conduct business, make loans, employ other slaves, and accumulate property, all theoretically with the master's tacit permission. In practice, the accounting of what belonged to the peculium and what the slave was diverting to their own use was difficult to monitor and generated constant disputes. A slave who built up a peculium large enough have to purchase their own freedom, as many did, manumission by self-purchase being one of the recognized routes out of slavery in Roman law, had every incentive to maximize that fund by any means available, including means that their owner might have, described as theft. There is also the darker side of this story, the theft committed against slaves by everyone else in the system. Slave dealers were infamous for their dishonesty in Roman literature. The Mango or Venalicerius pass, who passed off sick slaves as healthy, old slaves as young, or slaves with criminal records, or violent histories as reliable and docile, using cosmetics and deceptions that Roman law listed in careful detail as grounds for the rescission of a sale. The ediles dict governing slave sales required dealers to disclose known defects, a rule that implies endemic non-disclosure and cheerful fraud. The Roman slave market was, in a very real sense, an institutionalized system of theft, in which the only question was who was stealing from whom at any given moment. And the slave at the center of these transactions had no legal recourse at all. Chapter 7. Woman and Theft. In the ancient society, Roman law was not designed with women's criminal activity in mind. The jurists and the lawmakers who built the Roman legal system conceived of it primarily around the activities of male Roman citizens, and when women appear in the legal texts concerning theft, they appear most often as victims. The wealthy matron whose jewelry stolen, the widow whose estate was being systematically plundered by an unscrupulous guardian, rather than as perpetrators. This tells us something about the assumptions of Roman legal culture. But it tells less than it might appear to about the reality of women's involvement in the theft economy of the ancient city. The evidence that does exist suggests what participated in property crime as both principals and accomplices, though typically in different roles from those most visible in the literary accounts of male banditry. The female slave who stole from her mistress's jewelry box, the freed woman who ran a receiver operation from her shop in the suburb, the woman who distracted a merchant while an accomplice empties his cash box. These figures appear in the legal texts and in the literary sources often enough to confirm that they were a real of the landscape. The actio furti was available against women as against men. Roman law did not exempt women from liability for theft, even as it imposed other restrictions on their legal capacity. The intersection of the sex trade and theft has already been mentioned, but it deserves further attention in this context, because it represents one of the few areas where women's criminal activity is relatively well documented in Roman sources. The meretrix, the female prostitute, and the lena, the woman who managed or procured for a brothel, appear regularly in discussions of robbery through strogging or drugging, and the legal texts address the liability of both for acts committed against clients. These women existed in a legal gray zone in Roman society, without rights, but with significantly reduced access to the courts and to social protection that made them both more vulnerable to exploitation and more likely to be suspected of exploiting others. Upper-class women who committed or facilitated theft appear in the literary record in a different register, usually as part of stories about corruption within wealthy household, or as accomplices in the schemes of male relatives. The wife who helped her husband hide assets to defraud creditors, the mother who assisted her son in raiding the family property before it could inventoried for estate purposes, the woman who used her access to a wealthy patron's household to divert valuables. These figures are more visible in the literary sources than in the lutex texts. because they represented a particular kind of social anxieties about women's access to the inner spaces of elite Roman life. What the evidence cannot give us, because no one thought to record it systematically, is the lived experience of the ordinary poor woman in Rome who stole out of necessity. The woman whose husband had died, whose children were hungry, whose rent was overdue, and who slipped bread from a baker's stall or took a piece of cloth from an unattended market counter. She appears almost not at all in the ancient sources. She was too common, too uninteresting, too lacking in the qualities of drama. Ancient writers inquired of their subjects. We know she existed because the conditions that would have produced her, poverty, hunger, the desperate arithmetic of survival that was full of wealth and very unequally distributed, were among the defining conditions of ancient urban life. But she has left almost no direct trace in the historic record. And what we can say about her is largely inference from the world around her. Chapter 8. Famous cations, criminal legends, Roman history, and literature preserve a handful of cases and handful of theft and robbery that achieved sufficient notoriety to enter the record with something like that the detail that allows us to see individual human beings rather than statistical abstractions. They are few, and they are filtered through the perspectives of writers who were almost universally wealthy, educated, and distant from the world they were describing. They offer flashes of illumination into the reality of Roman criminal life that the legal texts, for all their precision, cannot provide. Felix has already been introduced as the most famous of Rome's highway bandits. But the details of his career as preserved by Cassius Dio are worth examining more closely. Dio was a senator and a careful historian writing in the early 3rd century AD, and his account of Bulla's 2-year career of robbery in Italy reads with a detail and a sardonic humor that suggests the story had circulated widely before Dio wrote it down. Bulla reportedly maintained himself through bribery of imperial freedmen who tipped him off about travelers and shipments, through a network of informants in the ports and markets who provided intelligence about what was worth taking. When soldiers were sent to arrest him, he reportedly appeared before them in the disguise of a magistrate and conducted a mock trial of some of his own men, then dismissed them all, a performance of legal parody that Dio found both absurd and pointed. The tribune finally sent to catch him was told by Bulla, once captured, that his masters should provide better for their slaves. A reference to the fact that many of Bulla's followers were runaway slaves or discharged soldiers abandoned by the state. People who had turned to banditry because their alternatives were. Bulla's comment, as preserved by Dio, is one of the closest things we have in Roman historical writing into a direct statement of the social conditions that produced organized crime, the literary genre of Roman mime, a form of popular theatrical entertainment that mixed comedy, farce, and parody, was full of thieves, and while mime texts survive only in fragments, The descriptions of mime plots that we have from other sources suggest that the clever thief was a stock figure of Roman popular culture in a way that the law courts and the juridical texts never quite captured. The fur who outwitted the magistrate, the pickpocket who robbed the rich man at the games, while the rich man congratulated himself on his cleverness in avoiding thieves. These were figures that made Roman audiences laugh, and laughter at these figures implies a complex attitude that mixed moral condemnation with a grudging appreciation for skill and audacity. The philosopher Apuleius, writing in the 2nd century AD, embedded in his novel The Golden Ass, what is probably the most sustained literary account of an organized bandit gang in all of Roman literature. His bandits, who kidnap the narrator, transformed into a donkey, and use him as a pack animal, while they operate from a cave in the mountains, are portrayed with a mixture of menace and dark comedy that reads as recognizable to anyone has spent time with the genre of crime fiction across any era. They argue about money. They have hierarchy and rules among themselves. They tell stories about their exploits to pass the time. They plan operations with genuine professional discussion of risk and reward. Apuleius was writing fiction, and his bandits are literary constructions rather than documentary records. But the specificity of detail, the way they talk, the way they organize, the way they think about their trade, suggests that he was drawing on a shared cultural knowledge of what bandits actually were and how they actually operated, a knowledge his readers would have recognized as plausible. There were also the famous cases of collective theft that shaded into political crime. The grain warehouse heists, the temple robberies, the diversions of public property that implicated not freelance criminals, but officials of the Roman state itself. The prosecution of Gaius Verres by Cicero in 70 BC, one of the most famous criminal cases in Roman history and the event that established Cicero's reputation as an advocate, was precisely a case of systematic theft on an enormous scale, carried out not by bandits or pickpockets, but by a Roman governor who had spent 3 years striving of Sicily, its artistic treasures, its public funds, and the property of its residents, with an enthusiasm and a thoroughness that his own colleagues found excessive. Verres was a thief of a different order from the fur manifestus caught at the games, but a thief nonetheless, and Cicero's prosecution speeches, the Verrine orations, remain among the most detailed accounts how crime was actually conducted in the ancient world when the perpetrator had access to these of the state. Chapter 9a, punishment and its limits. What happened to the Roman thief who was caught? The answer depended, as it always does in questions of punishment, not only on what had been done, but who had done it, and who had been wronged. Roman justice was not blind in the sense of treating all defendants equally before the law. It was explicitly attentive to status, to the question of whether the accused was a Roman citizen, a free non-citizen, a freedman, or a slave, and the penalties available and typically imposed varied enormously across these categories. for the Roman citizen convicted of ordinary theft. The non-manifest thief, who had been found out through legal process rather than caught in the act. The primary sanction was financial, the payment of double or fourfold damages, depending on the circumstances of the theft and the period of Roman legal history. In question was the standard outcome. This could be ruinous for a poor man, manageable for a wealthy one, and meaningless for a slave acting without personal assets. The financial sanction worked reasonably well as a deterrent for people who had something to lose: property, reputation, the sole capital that came with being a respectable member of Roman society. It worked very badly as a deterrent for those who had nothing. Physical punishment was reserved primarily for those whom the law did not fully protect. Slaves and the humiores, the lower orders of free society. The whipping of a convicted slave was a routine form of punishment that required no special judicial process. Execution by crucifixion, by being thrown to wild beasts in the arena, by being sown in a sacknet with animals and drowned in the Tiber, was available for the most cases, and the criteria for what constituted serious enough for the death penalty expanded over time, particularly for slaves. The slave who stole was liable to execution in ways that a free man was not. And the public nature of executions, staged in the arena, designed for maximum visibility, was explicitly intended as deterrence. Whether it served that purpose is another matter. Exile was another tool in the Roman penal arsenal, and for citizens of higher status, it could substitute for more violent punishments. A man of equestrian or senatorial rank of a serious crime might be sent into exile, banished from Rome, from Italy, or from the empire, entirely depending on the severity of the case, rather than physically punished or executed. This was partly a practical acknowledgement that Roman courts were reluctant to apply to the wealthy the bodily punishments reserved for the poor, and partly a recognition that a man of standing had in his reputation and his social connections a form of capital whose loss was itself a significant event. For a senator, exile was professional and social death, even if it was not literal death. And Roman sources suggest that some exiles found the prospect so insupportable that they preferred the alternative, the prison. The carcer was not a punishment in Roman law in the sense of a sentence to be served. The carcer was a holding facility for those awaiting trial or awaiting execution, not a place where people were confined as a penalty for what they had already done. The Roman penal imagination did not encompass imprisonment as a primary sanction in the way that modern systems do. Partly because the cost of feeding and housing a prisoner was one the Roman state was reluctant to absorb, and partly because Roman ideas about punishment were oriented toward public, visible, immediately satisfying responses to crime rather than the prolonged invisible suffering of incarceration. When we read about thieves in Roman sources, we are reading about people who faced prospect of physical punishment, financial ruin, enslavement, but not typically of the years-long imprisonment that modern criminals might anticipate. Chapter 10. These networks urge large crime. In Roman writers occasionally use language that suggests something more organized than individual opportunism when they describe the criminal world of the city and the roads. The word factio, a group organized for a common purpose, appears in contexts that suggest coordinated criminal activity. The latrocinium, banditry in its organized form, clearly required the kind of coordination, communication, and shared infrastructure that the word organization implies, and the logistics of moving stolen goods from their point of acquisition through the receiver to eventual legitimate sale required the kind of stable working relationships and mutual trust that can only develop over time between people who have found each other reliable. The infrastructure of organized crime in Rome was built partly on the institution of the collegium. The Roman association or club, a fundamental unit of Roman social organization that could be formed for religious, professional, or simply social purposes, and that provided a legal framework for action. The collegia of the lower classes, the craftsmen's guilds, the burial societies, the associations of workers in specific trades, were both legitimate and potentially criminal in Roman official eyes, and the government's attitude toward them oscillated between tolerance and suspicion depending on the political. An emperor who feared that the collegia were being used political organization or for coordinating collective criminal activity could and did suppress them. The suspicion was not entirely paranoid. An association that provided mutual aid, shared resources, and a sense of solidarity, among its members was exactly the kind of social infrastructure that could support criminal activity as easily as legitimate trade. The suburba and the other dense urban neighborhoods of Rome had what we might recognize as territorial organization. Specific blocks or streets or sections of the market controlled by specific networks, with the kind of informal enforcement of those boundaries that characterizes organized crime in any era. The evidence for this is largely indirect, archaeological, literary, and inferential from the legal texts. But the structure of Roman urban space, with its stable populations of shopkeepers, landlords, and neighborhood authorities who knew everyone and everything, would have produced exactly the kind of territorial awareness and network structure that organized criminal activity requires. The docklands along the Tiber were a particular nexus of organized criminal activity, as they have been in every port city throughout history. The grain, oil, wine, and luxury goods that flowed into Rome from across the empire moved through the docks at Ostia and the warehouses, the Huria, along the Tiber, and the opportunities for systematic diversion at every stage of this movement were enormous. The men who loaded and unloaded ships, the warehousemen who recorded and stored goods, the transport workers who moved merchandise through the city. These were low-paid workers with access to enormous wealth, and the gap between their legal wages and the value of what passed through their hands created conditions that were almost irresistible. Inscriptions and papyri from the Roman period record the losses, and the imperial supply system sustained through these channels. But the scale of what was successfully stolen without detection is by definition invisible to the historical record. What the ancient sources do not give us, because they were not written with this purpose, is a detailed map of who knew whom, of how the networks of thief and receiver and fence and corrupt official connected to each other, of how information moved through the system to enable the kind of large-scale organized theft that clearly existed. We know it existed because the losses were too large, consistent, to be accounted for by random individual theft alone. We know it required coordination because some operations require multiple people with specific skills acting in concert. But the names and the relationships and the internal dynamics of these networks are, with very few exceptions, lost. They did not write memoirs. They did not leave records. Criminality was their camouflage, and it has served them well across 2,000 years. Chapter 11. Provincial Domainthin. Theft beyond Rome was not only a city, it was an empire that stretched from Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain to the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia, from the Atlas Mountains of Nero's Mount Rurchas of Danubio, encompassing a diversity of peoples, languages, legal traditions, economic conditions, and ecological environments so vast, any single generalization about crime and theft in the Roman world immediately requires qualification. Theft in Roman Egypt was not the same as theft in Roman Britain. In the Syrian desert had a different character from banditry in the forests of Germany, and the experience of provincial people under Roman rule added a dimension to property crime that the urban Roman sources rarely acknowledge. The systematic theft of provincial wealth by the empire itself. The papyri of Roman Egypt preserve a documentary record of provincial life that is unparalleled anywhere else in the ancient world. And among the thousands of surviving papyri are complaints, petitions, legal proceedings, and private letters that illuminate property crime at a level of individual detail that the literary sources never approach. A farmer in the Fayum writes to the local prefect complaining that his neighbor stole his donkey. A woman in an Oxyrhynchus petitions the authorities about a break in her house that she attributes to named individuals. A merchant reports that goods he sent downriver on a boat never arrived, and he suspects the boatman. These are small stories, individually insignificant in the grand sweep of Roman history. Collectively, they create a picture of a society in which property crime was constant, in which people were willing to engage the legal system to address it, and in which the relationship between victim and perpetrator was often a matter of neighborhood and personal acquaintance, rather than the anonymous urban crime of the city. In the western provinces, Gaul, Spain, Britain, the Rhine and Danube frontier zones, banditry was as a persistent problem that Roman military and administrative authorities addressed with varying degrees of success across the centuries of the empire. The Bagode, a term for armed groups of displaced peasants and others who turned to organized violence and robbery, primarily in Gaul from 3rd century AD onward, represent one of the most interesting intersections of social history and criminal history in the late Roman period. The Bagaudae have interpreted variously as social revolutionaries, as desperate refugees from the economic disruptions of the 3rd century crisis, and as simply bandits who operated on a large scale in conditions where Roman military control had weakened. The truth, as with most historical phenomena, was probably all of these things in different combinations at different times and places. The tax collection system of the Roman Empire was itself a form of organized petty crime in the eyes of many provincial inhabitants. Though the Romans would not have described it that way, the publicani, the private tax farmers who collected taxes in the Republic, were notorious throughout the Mediterranean world for their rapacity, and the transition to direct imperial taxation under Augustus represented in part a response to the abuses that private tax farming had generated. But even direct imperial taxation left enormous room for individual enrichment at the expense of the taxed, and the complaints preserved in papyri and inscriptions from across the provinces describe officials who demanded more than they were entitled to, who accepted bribes, who created fictitious assessments to extract illegal payments. The line between legitimate tax collection and theft was one that Roman officials regularly crossed, and the provinces paid the difference. In the eastern provinces, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, the survival of older urban traditions and commercial networks that predated Roman conquest meant that organized property crime operated in environments with their own established patterns that Roman rule overlaid, but did not entirely replace. The criminal networks of Alexandria, the largest city in the Roman world after Rome itself, and up a place of extraordinary ethnic and commercial diversity, operated in ways that the Roman authorities in the city found perpetually difficult to understand and control. Egyptian law and Greek law and Roman law coexisted uneasily in Alexandria, and the interstices between these legal systems, the questions of which law applied to which transaction, court had jurisdiction over which dispute, which official was responsible for enforcing which rule, were precisely kind of ambiguity that skilled criminals throughout history have exploited. Chapter 12 of The Legis. What Thieves tell you as 2,000 years separate us from the Roman thieves, whose world this account has tried to reconstruct, and yet the reconstruction is curiously familiar. The pickpocket working the crowd at a public event, the housebreaker who has studied the target and waits for the right opportunity, the organized network of receivers who convert stolen goods into cash, the official who uses the power of their position to steal on a scale that no ordinary criminal could match, the highway robber who operates in the spaces between centers of authority, the poor person who steals out of hunger and desperation, All of these figures are recognizable because they are, in their essential dynamics, timeless features of urban life in stratified societies. What is specifically Roman about Roman theft is the particular context that produced it. The extraordinary concentration of population in a city without adequate infrastructure. The radical equality of a slave economy in which human beings were property. The sophisticated legal system that attempted to address property crime while simultaneously creating and protecting the conditions that produced it. The vast road network that simultaneously enabled commerce and enabled robbery. The empire that simultaneously guaranteed a degree of peace and security across an enormous space, while extracting resources from its subject peoples, with a thoroughness that left many of them with nothing to lose. Roman law on theft was one of the founding documents of stern legal thought, and the distinctions that Roman jurists drew between manifest and non-manifest theft, between theft and robbery, between principal and accomplice, between the rights of the victim and the interests of the state, shaped the development of criminal law in every legal system that descended from the Roman tradition, which to say most of the legal systems that govern the lives of people in the world today. When modern legal systems distinguish between theft and aggravated theft, between burglary and simple larceny, between the thief and the receiver, they are drawing on conceptual frameworks that Roman lawyers developed in the libraries of first and second century Rome, working through hypothetical cases with the same intellectual energy that their successors would bring to the same problems in every subsequent century. The thieves themselves, the men and women who lived the lives that generated all these legal deliberations, are mostly lost. The pickpocket who worked the Circus Maximus on the day of the chariot races in the reign of Trajan, the housebreaker who entered a wealthy merchant's domus on the Escalini Hill through the back wall on a moonless night, the woman who sieved stolen silver in her thermopylium in the Subura and sold it to a dealer in the Velabrum who did not ask questions. These people have left almost indirect trace in the historical record. They are present in the aggregate, in the statistics of legal texts and administrative complaints, in the background of literary scenes whose authors were focused on other things, but the texture of their individual lives, the decisions they made and why they made them, the relationships that sustained them and the fears that haunted them, the particular quality of a Roman knight in the narrow streets of the Suburia with something valuable under your cloak, and the hope. The vigils were busy elsewhere. This is largely beyond recovery. What we can say with the confidence that comes from reading every surviving source and listening to what it implies as well as what it states, is that the Roman world could not have functioned as it did without the parallel economy that operated in its shadows. The market that absorbed stolen goods was the same market that absorbed legitimate goods. The network of informants that served the bandit also served the merchant. The corrupt official who looked away from the warehouse theft was thus the same official who certified the legitimate shipment. The poor man who stole to eat was the same poor man who provided the labor on which Roman prosperity depended. The shadow economy was not separate from the Roman economy. It was part of it, woven into its fabric with a thoroughness that no emperor's edict and no legal treatise could disentangle. Rome gleamed. That is still true. But in the shadows of the gleaming marble, in the alleys between the temples and the apartment blocks, in the crowd, in the aim, at the games, and on the roads between cities, in the docks along the Tiber and the markets of the Subura, life was lived in all its complexity and its desperation and its ingenuity. The thieves of ancient Rome were not an aberration in that life. They were a part of it, as much as the senators and the soldiers and the philosophers, whose stories have been told more often and more fully. Their story is Rome too, and Rome, in all its darkness and its light, deserves to be told whole.